This video discusses a solved criminal case involving violence. While details are presented in a factual, documentary-style manner, viewer discretion is advised. In the mid-1980s, a series of events in a quiet English community would change the course of criminal investigation forever. What began as the murder of a teenage girl soon became a landmark case in British legal history, not because of its brutality, but because of how it was solved. This is the story of Colin Pitchfork, a case that introduced DNA profiling into criminal justice for the first time, and demonstrated how science could succeed where traditional policing had failed. Before examining what led up to the murders, it is important to first look at the lives of the victims and the background of Colin Pitchfork himself. Understanding who they were provides essential context for the events that followed. Before discussing the crimes themselves, it's important to acknowledge that both victims in this case were minors. As a result, and out of respect for their families, very little detailed personal information about their lives is publicly available online. What is known comes largely from official records and contemporary reporting. Lynda Mann was 15 years old and lived in the village of Narborough, Leicestershire. At the time, Narborough was a small, close-knit community where serious violent crime was considered rare. In November 1983, Lynda had been babysitting and was walking home along a route she was familiar with. When she failed to return home, concern quickly grew. Her body was discovered the following morning on a local footpath. The murder had a profound impact on the community. It marked a sudden loss of innocence in an area where residents felt safe, and it would later become clear that this was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a case that would change criminal investigation in the United Kingdom. Dawn Ashworth was 15 years old and lived in the nearby village of Enderby, Leicestershire. Like Narborough, Enderby was a quiet residential area where families generally felt safe. In July 1986, Dawn had been visiting a friend and was making her way home using a familiar route. When she did not return, a search was launched. Her body was discovered 2 days later near a wooded footpath. The similarities between Dawn Ashworth's murder and the earlier killing of Lynda Mann raised immediate concerns among investigators. For the local community, the discovery confirmed fears that the earlier crime had not been an isolated event, and that a serious offender had remained undetected for several years. Colin Pitchfork was born 23rd March 1960 in Littlethorpe, Leicestershire, England. His parents were Molly Beck and Alwyn Pitchfork. Pitchfork had a brother and a sister and were the second oldest. He grew up in an ordinary family environment and spent his childhood in the same general area where the crimes would later take place. Very little detailed information about Pitchfork's parents has been made public. What is known is that he was raised within a stable household and attended local schools. There is no public record of significant childhood trauma, family instability, or circumstances that would have set him apart from others in his community. As a young person, Pitchfork did not attract particular attention from authorities. He was able to blend into everyday life, later finding work in a local bakery. To those around him, he appeared unremarkable, a factor that would later contribute to how he avoided suspicion for several years. Understanding Pitchfork's early life is not about finding justification for his actions, but about recognizing that serious crimes can be committed by individuals who outwardly appear ordinary. His background offered no obvious warning signs, reinforcing how difficult such offenders can be to identify. Pitchfork married a social worker in early 1981. His wife attended Southfields College of Further Education in the late 1970s and grew up at 21 Meadvale Road in Knighton, Leicester. Before his marriage, Pitchfork had been convicted of indecent exposure and had been referred for therapy to the Carlton Hayes Hospital, Narborough. Pitchfork obtained work in Hampshire's bakery in Leicester in 1976 as an apprentice at the bakery head office on King Richard III Road. Coombs Hampshire's closed in 2011 near the present-day Castlemead Academy. He continued to work there until his arrest for the murders. He became particularly skilled as a sculptor of cake decorations and had hoped eventually to start his own cake decorating business. According to his supervisor, he was a good worker and timekeeper, but he was moody, and he couldn't leave women employees alone. He was always chatting them up. In early 1987, police asked every local male between the ages of 16 and 34 to voluntarily give blood samples for DNA testing. By the end of January, 1,000 men had been tested. Men who declined to give blood samples found themselves under scrutiny by police. According to 1988 news reports, one of Pitchfork's colleagues at the bakery, 23-year-old Ian Kelly, who lived outside the area under investigation, was overheard in a Leicester pub discussing how he had provided a blood sample on Pitchfork's behalf by using a fake passport to masquerade as Pitchfork. He had agreed to do this in exchange for £200 and took the test on the 29th of January 1987. Another work colleague also mentioned that they had likewise been approached to take the DNA test for Pitchfork. The conversation during the lunchtime of Saturday, the 1st of August 1987, was overheard by other bakery colleagues and 28-year-old Jackie Fogan, née Tyson, of Fleckney. She reported it to the police, but not until the 18th of September. This vital tip-off was later credited with enabling Pitchfork's capture. Pitchfork had told Kelly that he wanted to avoid being harassed by police because of his prior convictions for indecent exposure. Kelly was arrested at 31 Stewart Street in Leicester on Friday, the 18th of September, and later receiving 18 months. On Saturday, the 19th of September 1987, Pitchfork was arrested at 32 Haybarn Close in Littlethorpe by Detective Inspector Mick Thomas. Pitchfork's wife tried to attack him when he told her that he had killed 2 girls. During questioning, Pitchfork admitted to exposing himself to more than 1,000 women, a compulsion that began in his early teens. He later progressed to sexual assault and then to strangling his victims. Pitchfork said this was in order to protect his identity. Investigators rejected this, viewing the motivation for the strangulations as perverted sadism. During his interviews with the police, he admitted his crimes, but lied about the level and nature of the violence he had inflicted on his victims. At his trial at Leicester Crown Court in January 1988, Pitchfork pleaded guilty to the 2 rapes and murders, in addition to sexual assault of 2 other girls, and conspiring to pervert the course of justice. In January 1988, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 2 murders and 10 years for raping the victims. He was also sentenced to 3 years for each count of sexual assault and 3 years for perverting the course of justice, with all sentences to run concurrently. A psychiatric report prepared for the court described Pitchfork as possessing a psychopathic personality disorder, accompanied with a serious psychosexual pathology. The Lord Chief Justice at the time of his sentencing said, "From the point of view of the safety of the public, I doubt if he should ever be released." The Secretary of State set a minimum term of 30 years. In 2009, Pitchfork's minimum term sentence was reduced on appeal to 28 years. On the 18th of March, 1988, George Davies would give Jackie Fogan a check for £10,000 at the next head office in Enderby. On 22nd April 2016, the Parole Board for England and Wales heard Pitchfork's case for early release on parole. Pitchfork's advocates presented evidence of his improved character, noting that Pitchfork had furthered his education to degree level and had become expert at the transcription of printed music into Braille for the benefit of blind people. The families of victims Lynda Mann and Ashworth opposed his release on parole. On 29th April 2016, the board announced that Pitchfork's application for release on license had been refused, but recommended that he be moved to an open prison. In June 2016, Michael Gove, then Justice Secretary, agreed with the board's recommendation, and at some point prior to 8th January 2017, Pitchfork was moved to an undisclosed open prison. In November 2017, Pitchfork was seen walking around Bristol, so it was assumed that he had been moved to HM Prison, Ley Hill in Gloucestershire. On the 3rd of May 2018, Pitchfork was refused release on license. The parole board said Pitchfork would be eligible for a further review within 2 years. Lynda's mother said the board had listened to us before the murderer. In 2017, it emerged Pitchfork would be released from open prison on unsupervised days out. On 7th June 2021, Pitchfork was granted release on conditional license. The Secretary of State for Justice, Robert Buckland, applied for a review of the decision under the terms of the Parole Board reconsideration mechanism, introduced in 2019, and Pitchfork remained in custody pending the outcome. On 13 July 2021, it was reported that the review had been refused, and that Pitchfork would therefore be released. He was released on the 1st of September 2021. In November 2021, Pitchfork was recalled to prison for breaching his license conditions by approaching young women while on walks from his bail hostel. His second victim's mother, Barbara Ashworth, told BBC News that she was pleased. He's been put away and women and girls are safe and protected from him now. There are complaints that the parole board was insufficiently cautious in allowing Pitchfork's release. Justice Secretary Dominic Raab promised a parole board review. David Baker, a former police detective who helped capture Pitchfork, believes Pitchfork could deceive the parole board and pretend it was safe to release him. Baker maintains Pitchfork is a psychopath and it will never be safe to release him. Although this case would later be remembered for its forensic breakthrough, the early investigation was marked by significant police failings. Following the murder of Lynda Mann in 1983, investigators relied heavily on traditional methods, including witness statements and confessions rather than physical evidence that could conclusively identify the offender. In 1984, a local teenager falsely confessed to the murder. Despite inconsistencies in his account, the confession was accepted, and he was charged. As a result, the investigation effectively stalled. The possibility that the real offender remained at large was largely overlooked, and critical time was lost. When Dawn Ashworth was murdered in 1986, it became clear that the earlier conviction had been a mistake. The similarities between the two cases demonstrated that the same individual was responsible, and that the original investigation had failed to protect the community. Even after DNA profiling showed that the man who had confessed was not the killer, further failures occurred. During the mass DNA screening of local men, Colin Pitchfork avoided detection by persuading a colleague to give a sample on his behalf. This deception went unnoticed at the time, allowing him to continue living freely within the community. These failings highlight the limitations of policing methods in place at the time. While the introduction of DNA profiling ultimately led to Pitchfork's arrest, the case also exposed how reliance on confessions, assumptions, and incomplete procedures can result in serious miscarriages of justice. The investigation would later serve as a lesson in the importance of evidence-led policing and safeguards against false confessions, lessons that have since shaped modern investigative practices. As of 2025, Colin still remains in prison. The parole board has decided that he cannot be released from prison, and there are no indications of any parole decision being made for him in 2025. The parole board's decision is based on his ongoing risk to the public and the lack of sufficient evidence to support his release. The case of Colin Pitchfork is remembered not only for the crimes themselves, but for what followed. It exposed serious failings in traditional policing methods, highlighted the dangers of relying on confessions, and revealed how easily an offender could remain undetected within an ordinary community. At the same time, the investigation marked a turning point. The use of DNA profiling changed the course of criminal justice, setting a new standard for evidence-led policing and helping to prevent future miscarriages of justice. While the scientific breakthrough became central to the case's legacy, it is important not to lose sight of the victims. Lynda Mann and Dawn Ashworth were two young lives taken far too soon, and their case played a role in shaping changes that continue to influence criminal investigations today. Thank you for your support, and remember, stay safe out there.